The last thing I want to go over in this section are dynamic components. A dynamic component is a component that can be swapped with other components. This allows you to toggle between components. Using dynamic components isn't difficult, but there are a couple things you should be aware of when using them. I'll discuss everything you'll need to know in this lecture. We're going to work in a new project. Using the command line, run the following command: npm init view at latest. Set the project name to Dynamic Components. Select No for all questions. Lastly, let's move into the newly created project. Inside the new project, install the packages with the npm install command. After moving into the new project, be sure to turn on the server with the npm run dev command. Since this is a new project, we'll need to clean things up a bit. Inside the components directory, delete any components created by the CLI. Open the app component file next. We'll want to remove a lot of the content. We'll delete the style block. The template and script block will be emptied out. Lastly, export an object with a property called name with a value of app. We're starting fresh to focus on the idea of dynamic components. We'll need to create some new components for showing how dynamic components work. You'll see what I mean in a moment. We'll create two components called About and Home inside the Components directory. For the About component, we'll add the template block. Inside of the block, we'll output a message. We'll do the same with the Home component. We have two distinct components. I want to display the component depending on a user selection. We'll create a drop-down where the user will be able to select what component they'd like to view. Switching back to the App component, we'll create a drop-down menu. We'll add two options, which will be Home and About. We'll use the drop-down to select the component we currently want active. First, we'll need to import the components. We won't be able to use them if they're not imported. Inside the script block, import both the Home and About components. Next, register them by adding the Components option to the configuration object. After registering the components, they're available to use in our template. However, we don't want to load the components. We want to load them depending on the value inside the drop-down menu. We'll need to store the selection in the drop-down menu to keep track of what component to load. We're going to define the data function inside the exported object. Inside the data function, create a property called component name with a default value of Home. There's nothing else we need to keep track of. The component name is all we need. You'll see why in just a moment. We're going to update the drop-down next. It's what will allow the user to toggle between components. Inside the Select Form field, we'll add the vModel directive. The expression will be the component name data property. We have the drop-down working and we have the components registered. The last thing we need to do is actually load the components dynamically. Vue provides a component called Component. We'll add that right below the drop-down. The Component component allows you to dynamically load in a component dynamically. You can think of it as a placeholder for the actual component. To set the component to load, we need to add the attribute is. We'll bind it. The value for the is attribute must be the name of the component that's registered globally or locally. If we want to be able to toggle the component, then we'll need to bind this attribute. If you don't bind it, then the component will always load the same component passed in. The value for this should be component name, which holds the value inside the dropdown. That should do it. Let's test the application by opening it in the browser. The app is running normally. The drop-down should have the Home option selected by default. The Home component is rendering because it's the default value for the drop-down. If we were to toggle the value to About, the About component will appear. We can continuously toggle between the two components without a problem. This is how we can create dynamic components. We can use the component inside our template. Then we can pass in the component name into the is attribute. We can create some interesting interactions with this component. For example, a tabbed component or menu navigation. There is something you should be aware of though. When a component is toggled out, it gets unmounted. This means that any data inside of it will not be available anymore. If the component gets reintroduced on the page, the data will be reset to its default state. We can even view the component getting unmounted by using the lifecycle hooks. Let's use the lifecycle hook to confirm that. Back in the editor, inside the Home component, we're going to add the lifecycle function. Inside of it, we will log a message indicating that the component was unmounted. After making those changes, let's refresh the page. If we were to toggle the components, the message should appear in the log. This will inform us that the Home component was unmounted. Every time I toggle the Home component, this message will appear. This is important to understand, as any data you have in a component will also be destroyed. Any events you may have attached to that component will become unavailable. The default behavior can work fine. Other times, you may want a component to persist. Vue provides the option of allowing persisted data. Back inside the app component, we're going to wrap the component with a component called keepAlive. This component does one simple thing. It keeps the component that's inside of it alive. Even if it shouldn't appear in the DOM, this will make sure the component lives in memory. If the component needs to be added onto the page again, Vue will use the one in memory rather than creating a new component. Back on the page, we can toggle the selections like last time. Everything works, but behind the scenes things are different. We won't see the message being logged inside the console because the component is not being destroyed anymore. Instead, it's being kept alive in memory, therefore the unmounted lifecycle hook is no longer triggered. Switching over to the Vue developer tools, we can see that both components are still inside the app component. Instead of completely removing one, Vue will set the component as inactive. This will mean that the data will still persist, but it won't appear on the page. This can be useful for when you don't want to make an additional request for the same data. Of course, this does have one disadvantage. Since the unmounted lifecycle function doesn't get executed anymore, then you won't be able to run code if the user switches off the component. You may want to run code when this occurs. Luckily, Vue compensates for this by introducing two additional lifecycle hooks that weren't available before. Inside the Home component, we'll add the two lifecycle functions called activated and deactivated. Inside both functions, we're logging a message. The activated function is called when the component is active. With both functions set up, let's refresh the page. As I toggle the components, the activated and deactivated lifecycle functions are called, thus giving you the opportunity to execute code when the components are toggled. That's about it when it comes to using dynamic components. I'm sure you'll find a lot of uses for this in your applications.